Hi, this is Justin Gordon, and I'm going to give you a quick presentation on making EmberJs work with Rails 4 persistence. So a couple weeks ago, I created a blog post called EmberJs Hello World, and what I did was I gave a few tips for setting up Tom Dale's intro tutorial video on YouTube here. And so it's a really good tutorial. It's a great place to get started. Totally encourage you to take a look at it. And I got some great tips on this blog post on how to set it up. There's a couple little details there that might not be totally obvious from the video. And I got the latest source code there available in a Git repository ready for you to take a look at. One thing, if you did look at the blog post, I'm not sure if you might have realized it, but the embedded right inside an iframe inside the blog post is the actual EmberJs application. Pretty cool, no server-side logic at all. This is just some plain JavaScript. So next, let's figure out what it takes to convert this application to use Rails 4 for persistence. What the application is going to look like is this. Here's Ruby on Rails, here's the EmberJS tutorial, and this one's actually using the database. So here I can say, hello world. Notice the text over on the left side, that updates at the same time. And here's the first part of it, and this part's going to be in markdown mode, so bold and italic. Pretty cool. I'm not sure if you noticed at the bottom down here, it was actually typing in the markdown. And additionally, I can say header level 2 like that, and some additional markdown mode. Pretty neat. I can say create this blog post. I can notice also the ID number there updated to number 3. I can edit this blog post, and I can say something else. I can say done. It saves it. When I edit this, notice that, watch this, watch right here and watch the title. Can do that, and it updates over here. So that's really the beauty of EmberJS. It's a full model view controller setup, and there's very little code to make this happen. If you add a post, you can notice here that the URL says post new. If I hit cancel, it went right back here to the post smoothly. If I make a new post and type in another one, watch what happens when it says new right there. I hit create and it changes to 4. It's a little bit of special stuff that needs to work to make this happen. And just so you know that this is actually with persistence, and this is actually at Heroku, I'm going to hit refresh, and everything loaded up. So what I want to show you is I want to walk through the commit history. I'm going to do that in RubyMine. So go in RubyMine, I'm going to go check out revision, and then when I go run, on my run tab, I hit stop, and then I hit start. I switch back into Canary, and by the way, if you aren't using Canary for debugging, you should, because it's got some additional tools that you're not going to find in plain old Chrome. I'm going to refresh the page. What do we got? We have the basic Rails application that you got if you type over on the command line, Rails generate app. Inside of RubyMine, the files that were created, if I show you inside the changes window and I click on initial, is we've got files like application.js. Now I'm going to walk through the diffs inside of RubyMine because it's quite a nice tool for browsing the Git diffs. The next commit that I've got is this file, git ignore. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ignore the CoffeeScript source maps because I'm going to add that to the gem file. I'm going to ignore my RubyMine files. I'm going to ignore public assets because I might end up doing some pre-compilation and I don't want to see those files in the commit history. So when I click on any file in the history browsing, I can hit F4 and it'll bring up that file. One thing to keep in mind is that in order for me to use that functionality, I have to make sure I check out the revision if that file was recently added. Otherwise, F4 brings you to the current version of the file, whatever you have in your workspace. There's even a nice preview mode inside of RubyMine to see the markdown file. Okay, let's get to where the action is. Now we're going to add EmberRails. It's really key to go to the instructions at github.com/EmberJS ember-rails. Let's take a look at the change I make to the gem file. These are the changes that are recommended in the instructions for EmberRails. So notice here, RubyMine's telling me that there's one difference in the file, and I could see very clearly what has changed. You run bundle install, and that updates your gem file lock file. So we can see here the dependencies of EmberRails. One thing that's pretty key is handlebar source is coming in at the RC4 level. If I didn't put handlebar source and specified it as that particular version, the actual current non-release candidate handlebars is a much lower version number, so we wouldn't get the right version of handlebars and EmberRails wouldn't work. Then I changed the gem file such that I was experimenting with removing some of the things like Ember source 10RC4, but the problem later on I experienced is that that actually doesn't work. That the original instructions in the EmberRails repository are correct. You do need these versions to work with the current version of EmberRails. I'm going to enable CoffeeScript source maps, and that's pretty cool. The next commit I'm going to show you is what happens after you call bundle exec rails generate ember bootstrap. That's what happens right here in step 4 of the instructions. All these instructions in getting started in the EmberRails README are absolutely critical. So what did that do? That added these files and these directories. And the reason why it's adding these directories of controllers, helpers, models, roots, templates, and views is that gives you a way to keep your files organized when you're developing your EmberJS app. For purposes of this simple tutorial, I've kept everything in a couple files. All the CoffeeScript is in one file, and all my view templates are also in another file. And that's just, like I said, because I want to keep the example simple. I'm also intentionally not going to put in any sort of validation. So app.js.coffee is created, and this is telling us which files are going to be referred to. Basically what this is saying is that as you add new JavaScript or CoffeeScript files to these directories, you don't need to worry about including them. They'll automatically be included when the application starts. The application.js file, that requires the main top-level files for running EmberJS, such as handlebars, Ember, Ember data, and it creates the application, app equals Ember application create. That's a piece of JavaScript code that initializes Ember. Router.js is set up as the default right here, and this is to be filled in. And the same with store. It's setting up to use a REST adapter by default. I'm going to be changing these in the next couple commits. So Rails gcontroller static index. This is a command that's going to run, that's going to create my static controller. So once I've got the Ember files installed, I'm going to create my controller. And this is what it looks like. The static controller is very simple. All it has is one method called index. There's a few other files that are created, such as a helper, which I'm not going to add anything to. Index.html.erb just has this default, find me an app view static index HTML. The routes file gets the additional controller method, get static indexed. There's a couple files and tests, but for purposes of this example, to keep it simple, I'm not adding any tests. I'm going to check out this revision, and let's make sure we can still start the application. So I hit stop, restart, go over to Chrome, and I'm going to hit refresh. Well, nothing happens because the default route is still there. There's a few more steps I need to take before I can run the application. In routes.rb, I'm going to need to add a route to static pound index. What that's going to do is that if I don't put any URL, then this is going to be the default route. It's going to go to static pound index. The other thing that I need to do to start up the application is I need to set this value in development.rb. And that's config.ember.variant equals :development. That's explained in the Ember tutorial, in the Ember Rails instructions. This needs to be set. Notice that this is not optional. This absolutely needs to be set, and it needs to be set in both development.rb and production.rb. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to check out this revision. I'm going to go over to run. I hit stop, restart. I'm going to go back into Chrome. I load up the default route, the default path, which is nothing, and that takes me to static pound index. I can also go static index, and the same page will load. Notice there's a couple errors, couple JavaScript errors, some things that are not quite defined yet. Let's go into the next commit. The next commit is I'm going to install the latest versions of Ember and Ember data, and that's done using the command rails generate ember install -- head. Those instructions are right here in the README. I'm not sure why the minified files are needed given the asset pipeline. However, they're included, and it's best to go along with the instructions for now from the Ember Rails project. We can see what the file looks like here if I click F4 when highlighting the file, and we can see we get the current version number, and this is the current version of Ember data. And this is the current version of the Ember file. It's going to be real important to know what version you're using in case you report any issues on Ember. The next commit, which I'm not going to go to in great detail, is the place where I brought over all the code that made the static application work. That is the code that makes this example work. I'm hosting the starter package, the Tom Dale tutorial, right in my Octopress blog, which is served on GitHub. And the reason why I can do that is that it's completely 100% static with just some JavaScript. But it is a full running example of EmberJs. So I'm going to bring this code, the JavaScript code, over, and I'm going to bring it into the Rails 4 version, which includes serialization. Of course, we're not going to be using serialization first, but my idea is let's bring the static application first, and then I'm going to convert it so that we can serialize the data. So what does a check-in look like? That check-in looks like this. I'm not going to go into great detail on what's in the CoffeeScript file or the index.html file. The reason why is that the code in these files is carefully detailed in the Tom Dale tutorial, and I've already given instructions on how to set this up so you can run this in your own environment. What I'm going to focus on is what it takes to convert this to using Rails 4 for persistence. I've synced up the files to this commit, and I'm going to go over to the Run tab. I'm going to stop. I'm going to restart the application, and let's see what we have. What we've got here is the same exact example that I had when I showed you the static example a few seconds ago. I can click on a post, I can click edit a post, I can click done. Now the post is edited, but if I refresh the page, there's no persistence. So what this is just completely 100% static application served by Rails 4. The next part of what I'm going to show you is, now that we've got the static part, what is it going to take to use Rails for persistence? I'm going to add, the next check-in shows what happens when I add the post model. This is very simply what happens if you do Rails generate, model post, and the attributes. Very simple. That generates the post.rb file, which just extends active record. We generate a migration. These are the table columns that are added. The schema is generated. I'm going to add in this commit a rake task to create some sample data, just like we have the fixtures file, the JavaScript fixtures. To make testing a bit easier, it's nice to run a rake task and have a few sample records. What this does is it calls schema load invoke. The schema load invoke resets the schema, essentially deletes all the records in the schema. I put in a little check here. If you try to run this in production, you have to use the -- force option. And it calls load data, and load data calls load Rails and load Octopress. So it just includes some very simple data. So this commit right here where I create the model is definitely not going to be enough to restart the application. There's no controller and there's no hookups into EmberJs. We're going to need to add the controller, and then we're going to need to make some changes to the CoffeeScript. Let's take a look at the next commit. The next commit, I updated to fetch data from the database and persist the changes. I'm adding the controller and the serializer for posts and the resource for posts and routes. So what exactly does this mean? Let's first take a look at what happens with the Rails backend, and then we'll look at the CoffeeScript. So the post controller, this file is added, and the file is a very simple, pretty much a template REST controller with index, show, create, update, and destroy. The big difference in this file compared to Rails 3.x is strong parameters. We have post params, and what that looks like is doing something like this. When you call update, you're going to say respond with post.update, and before we would have something like params post right here, but instead we have post params. Notice the create method, I haven't updated that because I haven't implemented the feature of using create. So post params, that calls this method params.require post.permit, and these are the attributes that are allowed. What does the serializer look like? The serializer is extremely simple. It just has the attributes we want to serialize. And when is the serializer used? The serializer is used from the post controller because we have respond to JSON. So by default, when we say respond to JSON and then we say respond with, we're going to use the serializer. Notice that the post controller will use the post serializer. There's no specification file that where you say that the post controller uses the post serializer. This is all done through the naming of the objects. Now, what happens to the CoffeeScript to make persistence work? We switch over from the fixture adapter to the REST adapter. And then when you say done editing, we say get store commit. And that's it. There's nothing else that had to be done in the CoffeeScript file. Change the adapter and add in a commit to save. I'm going to sync up this revision and let's see if this functionality works. Check out revision. I go to run, stop, restart. what I've got now is I've got one of the records that I had in the example that I was experimenting with before, right here. So I can edit this record. Hello world. This is some bold text. And this is a header. As you can see, we've got the markdown updating in place below. One thing I want you to notice is when you edit the title, everywhere this title is displayed on the screen, which is right here and right here, it updates as well. So that's kind of neat. And that's an example of the model view controller feature that Ember gives you. I'm going to hit done, and that should be calling commit. I'm going to hit refresh, and let's see if that stayed around. Well, it doesn't look any different, and that's because it was persisted. Let's take a look in the Rails console, and let's see if we could see anything there that's interesting. I scroll through the Rails console, and I find this interesting bit. Started put post. Notice it says processing the update, post controller pound update is JSON. Here's the parameters. A couple extra parameters were passed, such as the author and published at, which weren't used. And then the post is updated, where a title, intro, and extended and updated at are set. That's fabulous. With such a small amount of code, I'm going to review this one more time just to show how simple this was. With just this tiny bit of code where we said get store commit, we added this very simple controller, which is a template REST controller, added a simple serializer, which again is and then we added a simple serializer, which simply lists the attributes. And then I had added the resource for post in the routes. That's all it took to make serialization work for that example that we have where you can only edit. The next step I want to show you is persistence working with a few additional features, which is mainly the ability to add and delete new posts. So what's this going to look like when we're done? We're going to have an add post button. If you click on a post, you have the ability to delete it if I want. I can click on this post, I'm going to delete this. This is actually really deleting it right on Heroku. I'm going to delete that one. And I'll delete this other one. And we're going to make the add post work. Let's take a look at the code to make this happen. Let's look at the CoffeeScript file first. We're going to have a new route. And it's good. This new route is going to be to create the new record. And it's very simply, and it has a model property, which is app.post.createRecord, and we specify the default values for some of the properties. Take a look at the blog post. There's something in there that you can call also when you call new route. You can also call, when you call route extend, you might be setting up the controllers, another thing that you might be doing. And if you do that, then this model code doesn't run correctly. I didn't quite troubleshoot exactly what caused it to go wrong, but if you do call setup controller, you'll have a very, very confusing time. So if you follow this example, it works just perfectly. At the bottom, for the app router map, I added route new, and notice route new is nested inside a post. The next part is I'm going to need a new controller for the post. I'm going to need a save and a cancel. So when you add the record, you can click save or you can click cancel. So when you save, it does a get store commit, just like for the edit. and then transition to route post this.get content. And that's because once it's saved, we can click on the, well, show us a real URL for the post. If you hit cancel, we'll try delete record, and then we'll try rolling back the current transaction, and then we'll transition to the route for a list of all the posts, since we don't have a specific post to show after we cancel. The delete functionality will be a call to delete record and then to commit, and then we'll also transition to the list of posts. And that's it for the most part to get this to work. There's a couple little tweaks to the helpers that I did in case the input is null. Let's see what had to change for this to work in the controller and the model. In the controller, what I did was I added a few different features for the allowable parameters. So I had published, add, and author. And the reason why is when I make a new record, I'm going to set those in the JavaScript on the client. That could have been done on the server as well. And the create method is going to have to use the strong parameters feature. I'm going to check out the revision. Stop the current server, restart the server. And I'm going to refresh the page. We've got an add post button. So next I'm going to show you the model change that I changed to make the example work for serialization. And that is simply I want to validate the presence of published, add, and author. Now what happened to the templates? So here's where I add the button. Notice it says link to post.new. Notice that the button to add a post is actually a link to a new URL. The reason why is that we want a new URL for a new post. It's not a simple action where we want the URL to stay the same, but we want a different URL for making a new post. For saving and canceling, those will be plain buttons. So for these, we call button action save and button action cancel. Another thing I did in the file is I refactored this template here, which is a template for post, because I wanted to reuse it for adding. So what I'm doing is I created a partial post edit, and that's what's down below. Is post edit, and that was there before, and then there's a partial post view, and this is a new template I just added right there. This code here for the view part was originally just in the post template. So now what I've got is I've got my post new and my post, and notice that the ID there corresponds to the route. I've got those using those two partials. So the post new uses the post edit partial, then shows a couple buttons, and then it shows the post view. For editing, there's a state, if editing, then show the done editing button, otherwise show edit and delete buttons. And don't forget, if you're editing, show the partial for post edit, and then show the post view partial. Let's see if this works. I'm going to refresh. I click on the add post. So this looks great. I can make a new post. I hit create, and there it is. Let's try deleting the post. Delete seems to work. So I'm going to make a new post. This is italics. That shows up correctly. I hit create, and it looks good. But there's a problem. the URL at the top is set to post null. Note if I click add post, the URL is set to post new. This is exactly what we want. But why is the post URL getting set to null? And the answer is actually, I've got the answer right here in the next change. So here's the issue. When we call get store commit, that's going to be an asynchronous call. And if we call transition to route immediately, then this .get content has a null value. So we can't do that. Instead, what we need to do is we need to put the code that's going to respond to the commit into this transition after save. And that's going to call the transition to route. And this is going to observe content.id. So when content.id changes, the transition after save, this method will run and the correct behavior happens. Let's see if that worked. So I check out the revision. I stop, I restart, and I'm going to refresh the page. Now I'm going to add a post. I hit create, and look at it now. It says post 8. So when I click on the post on the left, notice that the post ID shows up. I click another post and it shows post 8. Super. So once again, that simple change was taking out the call right after the commit because it's asynchronous and moving it into transition after save, which is going to observe the content.id. This essentially is like a future call, and this happens at the right time once the ID is properly set from the server. For the most part, this is working pretty darn good, and this is ready for deployment on Heroku. Let's take a look at what it takes to get this working on Heroku. Keep in mind that the commit descriptions I put have some nifty tips in here, so this will tell you what's needed. The article that I wrote has additional tips on getting the code set up for Heroku, which involves change a few gems, switch from SQLite to Postgres. I'm going to use a Puma web server as that's what the example that I emulated was using, and it seems to work great. And we're going to need to update the production RB file because, like I said, the instructions in the Ember Rails README file are not correct. Those steps are not optional. And it's a little bit, you'll get this confusing error, which I put in the article so that if you did see that error and you did a search for it, you might come up with my article. And you'll see the solution is that you need to put production in your, config Ember variant production in production.rb. Let's take a look at these changes. So I update my database YAML because you're going to need to do that for Postgres. You need to make a few gem changes. These gems for Heroku are, there's a link in my blog article for the details of putting these Heroku gems in. These are necessary. Here's a gem for Postgres, and I comment out the SQLite gem. I also put back in gem handlebar source. That was absolutely needed in there for the Heroku deployment. I also add the gem Puma, and it's critical to specify the Ruby version of 2.0 if you're using Rails 4. Here's a simple proc file I added to run Puma, and that's something that Heroku will use to start the Puma server. Here's a change to production.rb that's necessary, config Ember variant equals :production. If you don't do this, you'll get a very confusing error message on Heroku. The next change I made to production.rb was that I couldn't, when I was running the Rails task, it didn't have access to the models. And I discovered through an article I found on Google is that This is necessary, at least right now in Rails 4. Config.dependency loading equals true if $Rails rake task. So that's a global flag that's set if you're running a rake task. The reason why this seemed to change in Rails 4 is that the config thread safe option is specified, and by default it's true for in Rails 4, and by default it was false in Rails 3. So once you get that going, you can deploy to Heroku, and let's see what it looks like. So as I showed you a little while ago, here's the app running on Heroku. I can edit this. I can hit done, and it's all saved. It's all persisted in the database. This works just like I showed you that was how it was running locally. However, there's a slight bug in the application that I realized after my initial commits to Heroku and my creation of the article. It's an interesting bug that will show you quite a bit more about how Ember persistence works. So I'm going to add a new post. Here's a new post. The problem is, right now, if you have post new up there, is what happens if you click the post over on the left side. You haven't saved it yet. If you look in the lower left corner, you can see that the URL is going to be post null. So I click on that, and it's post null. So some things aren't working right. So let's fix this problem so that we don't end up with this post null, because that's really an error. Because sooner or later, someone's going to refresh the page on that, and what it's going to be is going to be an error right here, uncaught. So there's the error showing right there, and I could actually bring it up in the Chrome debugger. So this is the key change. For this change, I actually made a very detailed commit message that's definitely well worth reading. It was not obvious at all what I needed to do based on the original Tom Dale article in terms of what I needed to do to make this work. There's a great Stack Overflow article on what's needed. So here's the change. So here's the change I had to make in the JavaScript to make this work. It's actually a pretty simple change in terms of the number of lines of code to make, but it's a little bit subtle. What I'm doing is I'm going to add app.postController. It's going to actually sort the post now as well, so that the newest post will show up first. And it's going to have a property called filtered content. That's a name that I'm giving it, and I'm going to use that in the view. It gets arranged content, and it's critical to get arranged content and not content if you want to keep the items sorted. And then here's the filter. And what the filter is going to do is that it's going to include the objects so long as they're not dirty. So content.filter, it passes in the item and the index, and item get dirty will return true for the dirty object. And then we're going to say when it's not that. So this is going to exclude the new object, which is dirty. And the key thing to do is you have to listen on this property arrange content dot add each. And that's the secret sauce that makes the listings update when you save the new record. The next change is the change that we're going to make to the template. Before we were saying for each record and model, but now what we're going to do is we're going to say for each post in filtered content. I believe that post is probably just the name that's given for each of these in filtered content. However, it could be specific that it's actually related to the fact that this is a post type. In any case, it's a good idea to name it each post so that we know what it is. This part gets a little bit confusing. Link to post, as opposed to before it was just link to post and this. So what does this mean? What's happened? Notice before we were going through the model, and now we're going to be going through each of the posts. So the first parameter here in the link to is going to be the route. So we're going to link to the post route. Over here, we're going to link to the post route as well. That didn't change. The difference is before we were calling it with this, and now we needed to call it with the post. So I believe that this post here, the second part, is a reference to this each post. This part here is a reference to when you're going through each model. Also note that we had to change title to post.title. Before it was just title, and now it's post.title. So what this kind of means is that before it was kind of like this.title, because we had this model object, and then so the title is implicit on whatever the current object is. Now we're being much more explicit, each post. So now we're going to call post.title, and we're going to call post.author. Let's see if this works. I'm going to check out this revision. I'm going to go over to run. Notice that we had this message before when the post was null, active record not found. So we definitely don't want to be putting that null in the URL. So I stopped the application and I start it up again. I'm going to refresh the browser. I'm going to click Add Post. Hello. Notice now we're not getting the new record is not showing up on the left-hand side. All we have is post new. I hit create, and ta-da, it showed up over on the left side. I'll do this one more time. Another post, I hit create, and it shows up on this side after I save it, and it shows up in the top. So that's kind of neat. What I've done so far is I've actually completed the example. We've gone through all the changes that were necessary to get the app running, to get a simple blogging app running, and even get it deployed on Heroku. I've got all the steps laid out in my blog article, and I think the Git repository will be quite useful. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.